What happens when a broken man finds a broken dog, and neither of them expects to live through the winter? Walter Riggs wasn't looking to be saved. Not after the railroad let him go. Not after cancer took his wife. And certainly not by a scarred German shepherd left to die in the snow. But healing doesn't knock loudly. Sometimes, it crawls into your life on trembling paws, and reminds you that even silence can be a way of saying, stay. Please. The wind in Cedar Hill, Colorado that winter blew with the bitterness of things left unsaid. Snow lay thick along the sidewalks and rooftops, softening the edges of a town worn down by time. Smoke curled up from scattered chimneys while old iron lampposts groaned under the weight of frost. On the outskirts of town, where the train tracks cut like scars through the hills, stood an abandoned freight station. Its windows had been shattered by years of neglect, and rust chewed the edges of its corrugated walls. It was here, at the edge of that ruin, that Walter Riggs first heard the sound, ragged breathing, broken and desperate, half swallowed by the wind. Walter was a man built from stone and silence. At 58, his frame was still broad though bent slightly from decades of lifting, hauling, and kneeling along the iron roads of America. He walked with a subtle limp from an accident no one remembered but him. His face bore the wear of quiet suffering, deep-set eyes the color of worn denim, a short salt and pepper beard, and skin creased from both weather and worry. Since his retirement from the railway after his wife's passing, Walter had lived alone in a modest cabin just beyond the station, surrounded by memories and pine trees that whispered old regrets when the wind blew through them. He didn't speak much, not because he had nothing to say, but because no one remained to hear it. That morning, Walter had been shoveling the back path when he heard it. Not a howl, not a bark. Just a whimper, hoarse, hesitant, almost human in its grief. He followed the sound with the deliberate gait of someone who's learned not to hope too quickly. Behind a broken stack of pallets near the loading dock, he saw the source. A German shepherd lay curled in on itself, half buried in snow and shadow. Its fur was once thick and sable black with tan markings, but now matted with dried blood, filth, and the unmistakable sheen of oil. Its hind leg trembled involuntarily. One ear stood upright, the other folded and torn. The dog raised its head slowly as Walter approached, revealing one eye swollen shut and the other wide with a fear so old it had turned into silence. Walter crouched slowly, lowering himself with a wince, his knees creaking in protest. "Hey there," he said, his voice rasping like winter boots on gravel. The dog flinched but did not retreat. That told Walter everything. Fear without flight. A soul beaten into stillness. He removed his coat and draped it gently over the dog's form. Beneath the ragged fur, he could feel the protrusion of ribs, like fingers reaching through skin. The dog smelled of gasoline and copper. Walter's hands moved instinctively, gently inspecting the body for wounds. He found an old collar embedded into raw, inflamed skin, a twisted band of metal wire, likely improvised, and left for too long. "Jesus," he muttered under his breath, not as a curse, but as a benediction. Cradling the animal carefully, Walter rose. The dog didn't resist. It simply leaned its head against his chest as if surrendering wasn't new. The trek back to the cabin was slow. Snow crunched beneath his boots, and pine needles sagged under icy weight. The cabin at 11 Fox Hollow Lane was small, 2 rooms, a fireplace, and a kitchen that smelled of black coffee and old books. He laid the dog on a blanket near the radiator and sat beside it, removing the metal wire with steady hands and murmuring words he didn't know he remembered. Across the street, behind a frosted bay window, a woman watched. June Holloway was 63, small-boned and sharp-eyed, with silver hair usually tied in a bun that never stayed put. She wore thick woolen cardigans and collected teacups she never used. Since her husband, Theo, passed 5 years ago, June had made a ritual of observation. She noticed things: flowers blooming early, mail left uncollected, dogs barking longer than usual. Her heart had softened with grief, and in her solitude, she had taken to writing anonymous letters of comfort to those in town she sensed needed them. She called herself Moss and Lavender. That day, she saw Walter with the dog and pressed her palm to the glass. "Lord," she whispered, "help them both." Inside, Walter cleaned the dog's wounds using warm water and iodine he kept from his wife's old cabinet. He worked slowly, whispering fragments of songs and stories, as if the dog needed more than touch to heal. After hours, the creature finally slept, a deep and tremulous breath that told of a battle momentarily suspended. Walter watched the chest rise and fall and felt, for the first time in months, that the cabin did not feel entirely empty. The dog stirred near midnight, lifting its head weakly to lap at a bowl of water Walter had placed beside it. When it met Walter's eyes, something shifted. It wasn't trust, not yet. But it was recognition. Walter reached out and ran a hand over its back. The dog didn't flinch this time. "Shadow," he said quietly, as if the name had already been waiting there in the room. "You're Shadow now." Snow fell harder that night, blanketing Cedar Hill in a hush that softened the sharp edges of pain. June Holloway brewed chamomile tea she didn't drink and wrote a letter she wouldn't send. Across the road, Walter sat beside a dog once lost to the world, unaware that both their stories had begun again in the bitter cold of a forgotten freight yard. The wind eased by morning, but Cedar Hill remained buried in snow and silence. The town's outlines had softened overnight, rooftops sagged under ivory blankets, pine branches drooped like bowed heads, and the old freight yard looked almost peaceful, as if it hadn't seen suffering for decades. Inside Walter Rigg's small cabin, the radiator ticked softly, trying its best to beat back the cold. On the threadbare rug near its warmth, Shadow, the German shepherd he'd rescued only a day earlier, lay curled into himself, his breathing steadier but still shallow. Walter had barely slept. His body ached from crouching and lifting, but his thoughts were louder than pain. He sat beside the dog now, holding a chipped mug of reheated coffee. The name he'd whispered the night before, Shadow, still lingered in the air, and it felt right. The dog didn't yet respond to it, but he hadn't growled or recoiled either. That was progress. Walter gently dabbed at the scarred skin around the dog's neck with warm cloth. He didn't know the extent of the damage, only that it had been inflicted slowly, by someone who wanted obedience more than companionship. As he worked, the dog opened its good eye and met his gaze, not defiant, not trusting, just present. That was enough. The knock at the door startled them both. Shadow raised his head slightly but didn't bark. Walter set down his mug and opened the door to a scene as humble as it was unexpected, a basket covered in a green checkered napkin and a thermos nestled beside it. A folded note stuck out like a bookmark. He looked around but saw no one. Only snow-covered steps and the distant creak of tree limbs. He brought the basket inside and opened the note. The handwriting was neat, slanted, and signed with 2 words, Moss and Lavender. Inside the basket were 2 thick slices of fresh sourdough, a jar of vegetable broth, and a cloth sachet of dried chamomile and lavender. Walter blinked, unsure what to make of it. He had long grown used to being unseen. But someone had noticed. Someone knew. Across the road, behind her lace curtain, June Holloway watched him retrieve the basket and return inside. She had changed into her heavier cardigan, the one Theo had always said made her look like a Christmas ghost. She didn't care. Her hands shook slightly as she cradled her teacup. She didn't believe in interfering, but she believed in signs. That man, and that dog, had both arrived in her view at the same time, and that meant something. Later that day, Walter ventured into town, bundled in his navy pea coat and faded gloves. He needed antiseptic, gauze, and if luck allowed, something nutritious for a recovering animal. Cedar Hill was a place of routines and familiar faces, and Walter, despite his years of solitude, was still remembered. The bell above Danner's supply chimed as he stepped inside. Behind the counter stood Adele Penwick, a sprightly woman in her late 40s with a head of auburn curls barely contained by a knit beanie. She wore oversized glasses that slid down her nose and a thick sweater with reindeer patterns in April. She was known for 2 things, remembering everyone's birthdays and asking questions no one wanted to answer. "Walter Riggs," she said, not looking up from her ledger. "Haven't seen you since the storm 2 years ago. Thought you became a bear and hibernated." "Still human," Walter said dryly. Adele looked up, studied his face, then softened. "You need something for the limp or the heart?" "Neither. I need supplies. For a dog." "A dog?" She blinked. "Since when do you?" "Never mind. We've got gauze, ointments, even some of those fancy canned foods people get for terriers with gluten issues. You want a basket or a box?" "A bag'll do." She didn't press further. Just handed over the items, included a tin of soft food on the house, and watched him leave with a look that was half curiosity, half relief. As the bell jingled behind him, she whispered, "About time." Back home, Shadow stirred when Walter returned. The dog sniffed at the bag, his interest faint but real. Walter warmed the broth and mixed it with dry oats, adding slivers of soft chicken from a can. He offered it slowly, sitting beside him, spooning out bits at a time. Shadow hesitated at first, then ate, slowly, deliberately, as though learning how to accept care again. That night, as snow fell again in fine flurries, Walter sat in his recliner and read from a book he hadn't touched in years. It was one his wife had loved, The Secret Garden. Shadow lay nearby, ears flicking at every page turn. At one point, Walter glanced down and found the dog watching him, eyes alert and soft. He smiled. "You listen better than most people I know." Outside, June placed another note in her drawer. She'd written 3 drafts already but none felt right. Instead, she wrote something simpler: "You saved something. That matters. You matter." She folded it, tied it with twine, and added it to the basket she'd bring the next morning. It had been nearly a week since Walter Riggs found the broken German Shepherd behind the freight yard. Cedar Hill remained in winter's stubborn grip, snow still lay crusted on rooftops, and the roads were more slush than street, pockmarked with salt and gravel. But something within the little cabin at 11 Fox Hollow Lane had started to shift. Shadow, though still thin and haunted, now rose to greet Walter in the mornings. The tail wagged, barely, shyly, but it wagged. And each time it did, something deep in Walter's chest stirred like coals being coaxed to flame. The third basket from Moss and Lavender had arrived that morning, more broth, a hand-knitted pour wrap, and a note that simply said, "Keep going. You're not alone." Walter hadn't responded, not yet, but he kept the notes folded neatly in an old cigar box next to his late wife's photograph. Shadow had begun to sniff at the notes, too, tail thumping quietly as if sensing the kindness within the paper. That afternoon, Walter decided it was time to walk. Shadow needed the exercise, and Walter, if he was honest, needed the air. The leash was a simple rope, loose and long, but it was more symbol than restraint. Shadow walked beside him, head low, eyes alert but calm. They moved slowly down Fox Hollow Lane, past snow-piled mailboxes and salt-streaked fences, until they reached Main Street where the town thinned out into flat fields and old barns. At the corner of Birch and Miners Way stood an old red truck, its frame dented, grille cracked, but still running. And leaning against it was a man Walter hadn't seen in over 15 years, Elmer Stone. Elmer was shorter than Walter, thick around the shoulders, with a belly that hung over his jeans like a promise broken long ago. His face was ruddy, half hidden under a thick beard gone to gray, and his eyes were quick, flickering between cunning and carelessness. A black Carhartt jacket clung to him, zipped halfway, revealing a stained flannel and a long silver chain around his neck. Elmer had once worked security for a livestock operation out west and had trained dogs for compliance, a word Walter had always hated. "Well, I'll be," Elmer drawled, pushing off the truck with a boot heel. "Ain't you a sight, Riggs? Thought you vanished with the rail line." "Didn't," Walter replied, voice low. Elmer's gaze shifted to Shadow. "That yours?" His smile was slow, curling. No collar, no tag, but I'd know that posture anywhere. He was mine once. Walter's grip tightened on the rope. Shadow had gone still, every muscle braced, tail down, ears back. His breathing changed, faster, shallower. His eye found Elmer's and locked there, not in greeting, but in dread. Not anymore, Walter said. You sure? Elmer stepped closer. Spent months training that mutt. He's got tracking, scent work, and a damn high pain threshold. Or he used to. His tone turned sharp. Wasn't easy work, breaking him in. Cost me time. Cost me money. He's not a tool, Walter snapped. Elmer spat into the snow. He was mine by contract. Had him chipped too. Still might be registered. That makes him mine, legally. Walter stepped between Elmer and the dog, his jaw clenched. You left him in a freight yard half dead. You don't get to come back now. For a long moment, the two men stood in silence. Then Elmer chuckled, cruel and dry. You got soft, Riggs. Always were sentimental. That's why you broke down after Clara. You'd rather bury a dog than face a fight. Walter didn't respond. He didn't have to. Shadow, who had been trembling, pressed his nose gently to Walter's hip and stood still. Walter turned away and began to walk. Elmer didn't follow, but his voice carried after them. Ain't over, Riggs. That dog's worth more than your whole house. Back at the cabin, Walter knelt beside Shadow, stroking behind his ears. You're safe, he whispered, over and over, until the tremor subsided. That evening, as Walter sat staring at the fire, there was another knock at the door, not a basket this time, but a human one. June Holloway stood there in a heavy blue coat, her silver hair tucked into a knitted cap, cheeks flushed from cold. She held a pie dish wrapped in a towel. I hope I'm not intruding, she said, eyes darting toward the ground. I thought maybe you could use some company. Walter blinked. You're Moss and Lavender? June smiled gently. I write notes. But I never said I was good at pie. He let her in. Shadow sniffed her once, then flopped back down on his blanket. They sat in the small kitchen, the pie untouched between them, the silence not awkward but sacred. June's voice was soft, steady. I saw you with him. I saw how you carried him. Most folks would have called the shelter. But you didn't. I couldn't, Walter said. He looked at me like he'd already been there. And worse. June nodded. He's not the only one. They didn't speak of Elmer, or the freight yard, or the bruises on Shadow's ribs. But when June left, she placed a hand briefly on Walter's arm. There's more good in you than you think. And in him, too. Walter stood by the door long after she left, pie still untouched, Shadow watching from the floor with eyes no longer empty, but beginning to fill. The snow came again that night, soft as breath, veiling Cedar Hill in silence. Inside the cabin at 11, Fox Hollow Lane, the fire had dimmed to embers. Walter Riggs sat awake, his elbows on his knees, his hands cupped together in stillness. Across from him, Shadow lay curled, but not sleeping, his breaths were shallow, uneven, as though trapped in a nightmare he could not outrun. The encounter with Elmer Stone had unsettled more than just memory. Something in Shadow had folded back into itself. His ears twitched at every creak of the floor, his body trembled at the faintest sound of a distant truck engine. Walter knew that kind of fear. The kind that doesn't arrive suddenly but builds in layers, like frost spreading slowly across glass. He stared at the dog, seeing not just a wounded creature, but something that mirrored his own hollowness. When Shadow let out a muffled whimper and clawed at the floor in his sleep, Walter reached out, whispering softly, "You're safe. You're not there anymore." But even as he said it, something inside him rebelled. Because he knew, he, too, wasn't free from where he'd been. By mid-morning, Shadow had stopped eating. He licked at water now and then, but when Walter offered warm broth, the dog turned his head. The injury around his neck had reopened slightly, and his left paw, once just stiff, now seemed swollen. Walter cleaned and wrapped it carefully, but there was more than physical damage at work. The light in Shadow's eye, the fragile glint of hope, had dulled. Walter stood at the sink, staring out into the white morning haze, his knuckles white around a chipped coffee mug. He was remembering something he hadn't let surface in years. The boxcar. It had been 6 winters ago. Clara was already sick, late-stage lymphoma, and Walter had taken a temporary job for a private freight company that didn't ask too many questions. They paid cash. All he had to do was log cargo weights and sign the clearance sheets. One night, the supervisor pulled him aside. "We're moving some dogs," he'd said. "Security dogs. Military grade. Don't ask, don't touch. Just make sure the manifest says, equipment." Walter hadn't known then what he was helping move, but later, when he saw the stains in the crate and the terror in those dogs' eyes, he said nothing. He needed the money for Clara's treatments. That silence haunted him. Shadow stirred behind him, dragging himself toward the radiator again. Walter couldn't breathe. He dropped the mug in the sink and walked out into the snow without grabbing his coat. The cold was a slap. He welcomed it. He made his way across the road. June Holloway answered the door still in her robe, thick wool socks on her feet, and reading glasses balanced at the edge of her nose. She blinked once at Walter, coatless, eyes raw, and stepped aside without a word. He didn't sit. Just stood near her window, watching frost trace patterns on the glass. After a moment, June spoke. "Is it the dog? Or is it something older?" He hesitated. "Both." She crossed her arms. "You can't treat old wounds with silence. Not for him. Not for yourself." He looked at her then, really looked. June was not a fragile woman. Though small in frame, she stood with a quiet strength. Her gray eyes didn't flinch. Life had taken her husband, her health some days, and even her dreams of teaching again. But she had not let it take her softness. Walter sat on the edge of her floral armchair. "I did something. Years ago. Helped men move dogs that looked just like him. I didn't know how bad it was, not at first. But I didn't stop it. And I think Shadow came from that same world. From something I was part of." June walked into the kitchen, returned with a mug of tea, and handed it to him. "Then maybe that's why he found you." He looked down at the steaming cup. She continued, voice gentler now. "If there's one thing I've learned from grief, it's this: regret will eat you alive if you don't feed it truth. But healing, real healing, starts when you give yourself permission to try again." Walter swallowed, nodding. "I need help. For him." She smiled. "Then you're already on the right path." Back at the cabin, Shadow had dragged himself halfway across the living room, trying to reach the window. When Walter returned, the dog wagged his tail once before laying his head down again. Walter knelt beside him, whispering, "Tomorrow, we go see someone." That night, Walter pulled out an old rotary map from the cabinet and marked an address he remembered passing years ago, the Portman Street Pet Relief Clinic, tucked between a shuttered laundromat and a used tire shop. He hadn't been inside, but he'd seen the Saturday lines of bruised cats and limping dogs. It ran on donation and heart. He packed an old laundry basket with blankets, set aside a towel to wrap Shadow, and wrote a note to himself: "No more silence. Not again." Outside, the wind howled, but inside the cabin, Walter hummed softly as he placed his hand on Shadow's ribs. This time, the dog didn't flinch. He leaned in. Just a little. And it was enough. The next morning, snow had stopped falling. Cedar Hill lay under a sky pale as porcelain, clouds thinning like breath on glass. Walter bundled Shadow gently into an old laundry basket lined with towels. The dog did not protest, just lifted his head once to meet Walter's eyes, then let it rest back down. They moved carefully down Portman Street, Walter pushing a rusted shopping cart with a bent wheel that squealed over every crack in the sidewalk. Locals glanced up but said nothing. A few nodded. One woman crossed the street. Walter didn't care. His focus was singular now: help the dog. Help him while there's still time. The clinic stood between a boarded-up laundromat and a pawn shop with barred windows. The sign above was barely readable: Portman Street Pet Relief. The paint faded and chipped. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant and dry biscuits. A woman behind the desk looked up as Walter entered and immediately stood. She was in her mid-twenties, short, with a wiry frame and alert eyes that were dark, intelligent, and a little tired. Her chestnut curls were tied back in a frayed green bandana. She wore a thick gray hoodie with the clinic's faded logo and a name tag, Mara Vitek. "Help him," Walter said, voice cracking slightly. He gestured to the basket. Mara stepped around the desk. Her gaze softened when she saw the dog. "How long's he been like this?" "I found him 10 days ago behind the freight yard," Walter replied. "He was near dead. I've done what I could." She knelt beside the basket and pulled the towel back. Her face didn't flinch, but her eyes darkened. "He's been through something terrible," she murmured. Her hands moved deftly, not yet touching, but hovering just above the scars, as if reading their story like Braille. "This here," she said, pointing to a raw groove on the front leg, "that's not a regular wound. That's from tethering. Metal. Maybe wire. This one, see the line around his muzzle? That's from a too tight restraint. Long duration." She glanced up. "Was he trained?" Walter nodded once. "Someone tried." Mara stood slowly. "We see dogs like this. Not often. But enough." She exhaled. "I'll need to clean the leg, treat the infection, maybe x-ray the paw. But he's stable, for now." "What's his name?" "Shadow," Walter said. "Fitting," she replied. "Stay here. I'll be back with supplies." Walter waited on a plastic bench, hands folded tightly, back hunched. He felt like he was shrinking under the weight of regret, under the sterile lights of a place that somehow felt holier than most churches. When Mara returned, she carried a tin of cream, gauze, and a portable scanner. "Mind if I check his chip?" she asked. Walter froze. He might have one. Dogs trained like this usually do. Ownership. Tracking. Sometimes more. She scanned slowly along Shadow's neck and shoulder. The scanner beeped. "He's chipped," she confirmed. "ID still registered. I'll look it up, see what I can find." 10 minutes later, she returned from the back room, her face tight. "Owner is a man named Elmer Stone," she said. "No address listed. Just a code linked to a kennel system that shut down 2 years ago. No legal claim anymore, but he's back," Walter muttered. "I saw him 2 days ago. Claimed the dog like he was luggage." Mara nodded grimly. "We've had reports. He used to run obedience trials. Underground stuff. Not quite dog fighting, but just as cruel. Pain resistance drills. Submission conditioning." Walter's hands tightened. "Can anything be done?" "Not without proof," Mara said. "Unless we catch him training or transporting in real time, or have video showing abuse, it's hard to prosecute." Walter exhaled, jaw clenched. "I'm sorry," she added, voice softer. "But we do have options. Surveillance. Monitoring. I have friends in animal control. People who care." Walter nodded. "Tell them everything." She looked at Shadow and smiled faintly. He's lucky you found him. That's why I named him that. Back at home that evening, the cabin felt heavier than usual. Walter placed Shadow on the blanket by the radiator. The dog curled into it, closing his eyes. Walter stood watching the window, hands resting on the back of the chair. He remembered the red truck. Elmer's breath like rot, his smirk like acid. Suddenly, Shadow stirred, ears perked, nose twitching, eyes fixed on the window. He growled, low and guttural. Walter stepped closer and saw it, headlights crawling past the house. A truck. Faded red. Crooked bumper. The truck idled for a moment, then disappeared into the fog. Walter locked the door. He sat beside Shadow, one hand resting gently on his ribs. The dog didn't flinch this time. Instead, he leaned in. Mara called the next day. I ran his registry again. The chip was tampered with. Someone tried to delete the data but failed. That alone could be grounds for investigation. Walter asked, will they move on it? I have a friend. Officer Jenna Lock-Catch. Animal Cruelty Division. If we can get more, just a photo, a license plate, anything, she'll act. Walter made a silent promise. He would get the evidence. But he wouldn't do it alone. 3 weeks passed since Shadow had stepped into the clinic on Portman Street. 3 weeks since Mara Vitek handed Walter the first sliver of legal hope. The snow in Cedar Hill had begun to melt, revealing the muddy veins of sidewalks and the cracked bones of asphalt beneath. Trees remained bare, but the sky had softened from steel gray to pale linen, hinting that winter was loosening its grip. Inside the cabin at 11, Fox Hollow Lane, light pooled gently across the wooden floor. Shadow lay stretched near the hearth, ribs no longer visible, his coat beginning to regain a faint sheen. He no longer flinched at sudden sounds. Instead, he would trot to the door each morning and sit like a sentinel, ears alert, eyes calm, as though declaring, I am here now. This is mine to protect. Walter stood at the kitchen counter flipping through the mail when he heard the knock. Not the sharp rap of trouble, but a tentative rhythm. When he opened the door, he found a tall, lean young man in his early 20s. His brown hair was tucked under a knit cap, and his eyes, a familiar gray, were cautious, but not cold. Hi, the young man said. I'm Ricky. Walter blinked. His voice caught in his throat. Ricky? The young man nodded. Mom, before she passed, she used to say you lived here. I wasn't sure if you still did. Walter stepped aside. Come in. Inside, Ricky's eyes immediately landed on Shadow. Is that your dog? Walter shook his head. He found me. Ricky crouched, holding out his hand. Shadow sniffed, then nudged against it. Ricky looked up. He trusts you. Walter sat down across from him. I'm still working on earning it. They spoke little at first, words like stones too heavy to lift. But gradually, the quiet filled with warmth. Ricky had been drifting since his mother's funeral, working part-time in a garage in Grand Junction, never staying long. But something in the news, a small local article about a janitor who saved a dog from cruelty, had stirred a memory. I thought maybe you had changed, Ricky said. But maybe I never really knew you before. Walter said nothing at first. Then he reached into a drawer and pulled out a folded photo, Clara, smiling, with a boy in her lap holding a toy train. He slid it across the table. This is who I wish I could have been for you. That night, Ricky stayed. Walter brought out the old pull-out cot, layered it with 2 wool blankets. Shadow curled beside it like it was the most natural thing in the world. 2 mornings later, they met Mara outside the clinic. She wore a navy parka too big for her frame, and her cheeks were flushed pink from wind. We have something, she said, her voice sharp. Ricky showed me a clip he recorded of Elmer the day he came back. The video showed Elmer's red truck parked behind the alley. His words were clear, spent months training that mutt. He's mine. The footage also captured the threat, you'll regret this. Mara added the chip tampering records and matched them with old reports of kennel closures linked to Elmer. Then she handed everything to Officer Jenna Lockcatch, an African-American woman in her 40s with keen eyes and a voice that brooked no argument. It's enough to open a case, Jenna had said. With this, we can raid if we confirm his location. The raid happened the following week. Inside a warehouse north of the highway, 3 underweight dogs were found locked in metal crates, bones visible through patchy fur. Training poles lined with spikes. Notes scrawled on whiteboards, B3, low bite. C2, passive. Elmer was arrested on site, screaming about property and registration and revenge. But the town of Cedar Hill did not weep for him. The local news ran a story, "Broken Dog Leads to Justice." The photo showed Walter, in his flannel jacket, standing beside Shadow. Donations poured into the clinic. One woman from Denver offered to adopt Shadow, but Walter declined with a simple reply, "He's already home." The next week, Principal Hargrove called Walter into his office at Washington Elementary. "You've been here nearly 7 years," he said. "The kids don't know your name, but they know you care." He handed Walter an envelope, a small grant, labeled Community Honor Fund, and a thank you card covered in crooked crayon signatures. Walter tucked it into his coat. He said nothing, but his eyes shimmered. At home, Ricky brought in a small cardboard box labeled Vocational Applications. He had enrolled in a local mechanics course and had started fixing up the busted snowblower in the shed. "I figured," he said, "if I'm going to stay, I better pull my weight." Walter smiled and handed him the last clean dish towel. Mara visited often now. Sometimes with supplies, sometimes with tea. Her laugh had begun to echo through the house like wind chimes. One evening, as the 3 of them sat on the porch, Ricky tuning his guitar, Shadow resting with his head on Mara's foot, she said softly, "He still watches the door like someone's coming." "They always do," Walter replied. "Until they believe they're safe." She nodded. "He believes it now. So should you." On the first day of spring, Walter stood on the porch watching a line of robins hop across the melting yard. Shadow was beside him, tail flicking. From across the road, June Holloway raised a hand, holding a small plant pot, lavender, blooming early. She smiled, and Walter smiled back. He turned to Shadow. "We made it." And in the quiet morning air, for the first time, Shadow barked, not in fear, but in greeting. Sometimes, God's miracles don't come wrapped in thunder or glory. Sometimes, they arrive quietly, on 4 trembling legs, with old scars and a heart still willing to love. Shadow didn't just need saving. He was sent to remind Walter, and maybe all of us, that no soul is ever too far gone, no wound too deep for grace. In our everyday lives, we walk past the hurting, the forgotten, the broken, both human and animal. But when we stop, when we choose compassion over comfort, we open the door to miracles we didn't know were waiting. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Comment Amen if you believe no life is beyond redemption. Subscribe for more true stories of healing, second chances, and the quiet love between animals and the people who never gave up on them. May God bless you and guide your heart to be someone's light after the storm.